Thank you to Yeshivat Chovevei Torah for having me. Thank you to everyone for joining. I'm just going to make sure my view is adjusted here. Okay. It's great to be here at Seder Sense, and I hope we can make some new sense of the Seder. What I'm going to do with you this evening might be a little bit creative. My background really is in experiential Jewish education, wanting to think about creative modalities through which to approach learning. And so the first thing I want to give you a heads up about is if you would just have a pen and paper handy near you, a pen or a pencil. I will be asking you or inviting you to jot something down in just a little while. And if you play along at home, please have a pen and paper handy. So we are going to talk about storytelling. Of course, the project of Seder night is the telling of the story. And I'd like to start by introducing a song from the Broadway musical Hamilton. As you heard, I have a podcast called Verses, where Broadway and Torah meet. This was sort of a discovery that I made through the pandemic when I went on to Zoom, as so many of us did, for my weekly class. It was now on Zoom, and we were all sort of depressed, needed a little bit of joy and something a little different. And I started to experiment with taking Broadway musicals or musical numbers from Broadway shows and pairing them with Torah text or Torah ideas. And so I discovered that when we take a very different context, a very different modality, we can find new dimensions, even in familiar narratives or familiar ideas. And so I'd like to start by playing just about a half a minute or so from the last song in the musical Hamilton, because it talks about stories. And for those who aren't so familiar with the musical, I'll just give you a little bit of context. As I said, this is the last song, and spoiler alert, Hamilton dies at the end of the musical, for those who haven't seen it. And this song is called Who Lives, Who Dies, Who Tells Your Story. And what we're going to hear is the voices of the people from Hamilton's life. So his life is over, and that's when the telling of his story begins. So I'm going to play the excerpt. And then, and as we're playing the excerpt, maybe just think about how it is that we tell stories, who tells stories, and how might different people tell the same story in different ways. So I'm going to share my sound, and please let me know if the admin can tell me if it doesn't work. Please let me know.
Let me tell you what I wish I'd known when I was young and dreamed of glory. You have no control. Who lives, who dies, who tells your story?
President Jefferson. I'll give him this. His financial system is a work of genius. I couldn't undo it if I tried. And I tried.
Who lives, who dies, who tells your story? President Madison.
He took our country from bankruptcy to prosperity. I hate to admit it, but he doesn't get enough credit for all the credit he gave us.
Who lives, who dies, who tells your story?
Every other founding father story.
Okay, I'm going to stop there. So this first of all, this song is a reference back to something that George Washington is the first singer in that song. It's a reference to something he had told Alexander Hamilton earlier in the musical. Let me tell you what I wish I'd known when I was young and dreamed of glory. You have no control. Who lives, who dies, who tells your story? So it's an awareness that a story is in the hands of those who tell it, not those who lived it. And it also is a recognition that telling a story is always a choice. And the person telling the story gets to package it, gets to determine it. And you even hear that in the opening of the song. The different characters are telling different aspects of the life of Alexander Hamilton. So I'm interested in thinking about storytelling as the project of the Seder and sort of asking, how do we tell that story? Given that every story is a choice, if if you're telling someone about an event and 3 different people were at the same event, you would probably get 3 different versions, 3 different stories, 3 different perspectives. And so it's a choice we make about how we tell a story. And just to emphasize that and to give us a little bit of experience with that, here's where I would like to invite you to pull out that pen and paper if you so choose to do so. And jot down, I'll give us just a couple of minutes to do this. If someone asked you, tell me about your life, without thinking too hard, I'm going to give you a very specific sort of directive here. Jot down 5 things that you would say. What are the 5 things that you would say if someone said, tell me about your life? And I'm going to do it too. So take about a minute or 2 and write down the 5 things you would say about your life. We'll give it a minute. And I know it's hard to narrow it down because there are so many things. That's my point, is that if you have to narrow it down, what would you say? Take another 20 seconds or so. Okay, and finish up. Now, I'm going to ask you to write down one more thing. This might be trickier, or it might be easier, I don't know. Now do it again. If I say, tell me your story, or tell me about your life, and I say, jot down 5 key things about your life, see if you can jot down 5 other things that you hadn't mentioned before. Tell me about yourself, or tell me about your story, or tell me about your life, with 5 key points that are different 5. Ready and go. Take just another 10 seconds or so. Okay. So my first point here is just that it's always a choice in terms of how one tells a story. I want to share with you an experience I once had. I was teaching a class actually related to this idea of telling stories on Pesach. And I started off by asking the people in the class, this was an adult class, an adult ed class. I asked them to go around and have a few people tell me your story, tell me your life story. And so the first person started and of course said, well, I was born in this place and I had this many siblings and I went to this school and so on. And I gave them a cutoff. I gave them only 60 seconds just to, like I did with all of you with 5 items. I wanted to give them sort of a boundary, like, okay, take 60 seconds, tell me your story. And the second person went and did a sort of similar kind of outline of her life, which is harder than you think to do in 60 seconds. And then I turned to the third volunteer and I said, okay, tell me about your life. And he said, my grandparents came over from Russia. And he went on to tell his family history. And actually, by the end of the 60 seconds, he hadn't even been born yet. I do see a hand in the Zoom room. I'm going to hold off questions and I'll ask for questions when it's an opportune time for the conversation. So I want to acknowledge that. And so the question of telling your story also begs the question of where do you begin? And every every act of storytelling involves a set of decisions, a set of choices. So I'd now like to share my screen and ask this sort of question of the Seder itself. How is it decided, or what story do we tell on Seder night? So give me a moment. And I will share the link as well. I'll share it toward the end of our conversation. Okay. So I started off here by simply quoting that first line of the song, Who Tells Your Story? Now, this is the core text of the story of the Haggadah. As you may know, it's the Mikra Bikurim, the first fruits declaration. And I'm not going to read through the entire text, but the text comes from the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy, at the very end of the Torah. And it is in the context of the opening of Parashat Ki Tavo, when you enter the land, when you've become farmers in the land, and when you are bringing your first fruits, which is a very exciting time of gratitude, then here is what you, the farmer, will say when you stand before God with your basket of fruits. And so I'm going to skip down to verse 3, Pasuk Gimel. So the command is Uvata el hakohen asher yihiyeh bayamim hahem. You shall go to the priest in charge at that time, and then you say to him, you basically give a sort of declaration that I am acknowledging that I'm here in the land that God promised. And the Kohen takes this basket of fruit, and then you make this declaration, verse 5, in front of the Kohen, and you start to say, Arami, Oved, Avi, my father was. Here it's translated as a fugitive Aramean. Sometimes it's a wandering Aramean. There are all kinds of translations for this text, but essentially it tells the story of the Jewish people coming down to Egypt and becoming a great nation. And then the Egyptians are threatened by this nation and they oppress us, and on and on. And if you read this text, this is the core text of the Haggadah. Haggadah lehagid, the core action that we're doing on Pesach night is to tell the story. This is the story that we're telling. And sometimes that whole Magid section, the Magid section is of the Haggadah, which is the telling section of the telling, gets sort of muddled by so many other things that come, the Manishtana, the 4 questions, and then the 4 children, which we just heard about, and all kinds of what one might call throat clearing or introductory statements about telling the story and when should we tell the story. And then we get to this core text. This is the story. This is what we use to tell the story of Pesach. And so this is a choice that the editors of the Haggadah made, because remember, every story is a choice of what one includes and how one will construct that narrative. And they're telling a story that they weren't present for. So the question is, why is this the core text? Why is this and not the story that's in Exodus itself, in Shemot? Why is this the text of the Haggadah, which, by the way, then gets elaborated and enumerated on, and there are connections then made back to other midrashim or other texts that are in Shemot, in Exodus. And so I wanted to bring for you, I'm skipping down, an observation from Rabbi David Silber, one of my earliest teachers at the Drisha Institute. He notices this choice of this story being told. So I'm going to just read what he says here. This is from his Haggadah, narrating, or in the Haggadah's language, telling, lesaper, is an activity that requires the presence of another. Indeed, the first fruits recitation must be performed in the presence of two entities, the Kohen, before whom the basket is placed, and God, to whom the pilgrim's statement is directed. The pilgrim story entails not only recitation, but also performance. It involves actual physical activity. So he says there are two things about this story that make it relevant to Seder night. First of all, it's not just reading the story or reviewing the story, it's having witness to the story. It's what we do on Pesach. We tell the story. And I have to think about that Hamilton moment, because Hamilton lived his life, and now his life is being recounted, retold by others. It is the telling to an audience, quite literally on the stage in that sense. It is the telling to others that defines the story. And here too, it is a declaration before God and the Kohen. And it's a story that has all kinds of props and accoutrements. So that is just on a very basic level, is very much like the Seder. But now I want to go one step further. And he says a little bit later, the individual who brings the first fruits describes his personal arrival in the land of Israel, although it is likely that his family has been rooted there for many generations. In other words, he's saying, I came to Israel, but he probably was born there by then. He relates similarly to the Exodus experience as though it were his own. And then he goes through sort of the choice of point of view or grammar choices, right? He relates, he does not say they suffered in Egypt, they cried out to God, or God responded to them, but rather we suffered, we cried, we were redeemed. This sense of relating intimately to an ancient event is precisely what the Haggadah means to achieve by requiring participants of every generation to view themselves as though they personally escaped bondage in Egypt. What he's referring to is Chayav Adam lirot et atzmo, that a person must see themselves as if they came out of Egypt, which is why we are there at the Seder and praising God and giving thanks. So the choice of story is that he's saying we about Egypt, even though it wasn't we, even though he or she, this farmer, was not present. And I'll go one step further. Just the fact that this text is being told by Moses to the nation of Israel, Bnei Israel, at a time when it is now the second generation, he is modeling what it means to retell the story to the very first generation that wasn't there. Remember, it's the end of his life, at the end of the Torah, and he's telling them, you're going to go into the land of Israel. And you know how you tell this story? You tell it using the word we. It is my story, even though technically it isn't. I'm going to move on. So that's sort of my first question was, what story text do we tell, and why do we use that story text, given that we have so many choices of how we might tell any story? The next question is, what is the narrative arc of the story that we're telling? Where does the story begin and where does the story end? It doesn't begin with Egypt at all. It begins, as we saw, with Arami Oved Avi, with saying that my ancestors came down to Egypt. It was, Yaakov and his family. And so it starts way before they were slaves. It starts with the people who received the covenantal promise and the prophecy that God gave to Abraham and God gave to our ancestors, saying, you will be strangers in a strange land. And now we see the realization of that promise, that we would be oppressed and that we would be taken out. And where does the story end? I'm just bringing you here. Dayenu, probably the most common moment in the entire Haggadah. Actually, Rabbi Margulies made mention of the fact that the Pesach Seder is the most often practiced ritual, even for Jews who are not so involved in Jewish life. And Dayenu, I think, is the most well-known I was once staffing a birthright of Jews who grew up very secular, and we were in the middle of the desert in the middle of the summer, and from the back of the bus, I suddenly hear them singing "Die, Dayenu," and I'm thinking it's August, but this is such an anchor for people. Dayenu goes through the stages of the story, sort of as a summary. It's the last moment of Magid, of the telling of the story. It's sort of a wrap up before we move on, and sort of in clusters. The first, what happened in Egypt, and then what happened when they came out of Egypt, receiving the man, going to Har Sinai, and getting into Eretz Yisrael. So where does the story end? The story does not end when they when they got out of Egypt. What is this choice of narrative arc telling us? The story begins before the enslavement. The story ends far after the oppression is over. And so this really is about the nation's mission in the world. We weren't just getting out of Egypt. We weren't just fleeing from something. We were fleeing toward a mission. We were coming back into the land of Israel, and into building the Beit HaBechira, the temple, building our society, and realizing our mission as a nation of God. So think back to what we experimented with in terms of our stories. What would happen if lirot et atzmo, if seeing ourselves in the narrative, meant actually thinking of my life story as having started before I was born, and thinking of my life story's end, God willing, after 120 years in good health, as ending after I am gone? What if lirot et atzmo, what if seeing ourselves in the story meant that my personal story maybe started in Egypt or started many generations before me? Of course it did. There were so many things that had to happen in terms of, my grandparents leaving Eastern Europe and coming to North America, in terms of the education that they gave to my parents, the Jewish education, in terms of the choices that my parents made and how they raised us. All of these things are part of my story. Of course they are. But when someone asks me, tell me about yourself, I actually automatically start with where I was born. But a lot had to happen before I was born in order to set me up for the beginning of my life story. And so on Pesach, the question is, where does my story begin? Where does my story intertwine with the story of my nation? I have something else I wanted to show you, but I want to pause here to see if there are any questions in the Zoom room. Feel free to put them into the chat, to raise your hand, or to unmute. I'll just take a quick pause before we move on to something more. Don't be shy. Okay. Okay. So lirot et atzmo, seeing ourselves in the Haggadah, asking ourselves, what does my story or my family's story have to do with the story of our people? It's easy to just stick to the script of the Haggadah, but the Haggadah is asking us to be creative. The Haggadah is almost a means to an end, not an end in itself, which is very difficult because the Haggadah is long, and often we just want to say what's in there and get to the matzo ball soup. However, the spirit of storytelling on Seder night is about telling our own stories within that story. I appreciate someone just messaged me, so the story never ends. Beautiful, right? So I'm sharing my screen again to share with you something from one more thinker and writer. This is, here we go, Rebecca Goldstein in the New American Haggadah. She actually starts by talking about how important storytelling is, and that it's something that we usually think of for children because it's playful, but that we have to learn from children to activate our imagination on Seder night. So here's what she writes here. It is not enough to merely tell the story, but we must live inside of it. Blur the boundaries of our personal narrative so that we spill outward and include as part of our formative experiences, having lived through events that took place millennia before we were born. I find this to be remarkable. She actually says it so perfectly. We're basically saying we were there and that's part of our story, even though we weren't there. That our narrative spills over. I love that expression, spills outward to include events that took place before we were here. And then she says, it is the imagination alone that can extend the sense of the self, broaden our sense of who we really are. We are Jews, insists the tradition, and the identity of an individual Jew is never strictly individual, but also collective. By extending our personal narratives to include the formative tale of Jewish identity, we appropriate that collective self as part of our own. So what's she saying? If I, as an individual, tell my story as part of the collective, then the collective story is also part of who I am. If I can succeed in finding some theme in the Haggadah, and this is what I'm trying to recommend. How do we do this? Maybe it's a theme of oppression. Maybe it's a theme of freedom. Maybe it's a theme of justice. Maybe it's something that I believe in my life, or something that my ancestors and my family have lived through. Many of us, myself included, have history that came through the Holocaust. But it might not be that stark or simple. It might be, when do we feel vulnerable? It might be who is a leader that we want to stand up to. But how can I make the collective narrative part and parcel of my own? That's what she is saying is the task of the Seder. So what's fascinating about that, and here's where I'm going to bring it back to Hamilton as we get toward the end of our time. What's fascinating is that we already do this when we think about our identities. When I say I am an American, or I live in Canada, or I am a Jew, or I am a New Yorker, or I went to this and that school, we make those statements because we think something about that collective group says something about me. And what I love about the musical Hamilton, what was so magnetic about it for people, is that it told the story of one individual, this person's life, and used that story to tell the story of the founding of our nation. Right? That's why, by the way, school groups were taking kids to see Hamilton. Like the kids would finally want to learn American history because it was so compelling. I mean, this is why people read historical fiction. I don't know, maybe that's one reason why people read historical fiction. Because when we tell a story of an individual, in the context of a collective narrative, it makes that collective narrative that much more compelling and that much more personal. And that's exactly what we're doing on Seder night. Lirot et atzmo ki'ilu, that we're seeing ourselves as if we really are part of that story, and that story is a part of us. Comments, thoughts, questions? Is this hard to do? Is this something people already do? Is this something where people sit around their Seder tables and share their family history so that the children and the grandchildren can see that that's part of the Haggadah project as well? I see a hand. Jane, please, are you allowed to unmute? I don't know if there we go.
Hi. I'm wondering, I'm going to have some non-Jews at my Seder. And I want to be inclusive of them. I wonder if you have any suggestions on that.
That's a great question. The Seder actually is a very particularist night, not a very universalist night. It's filled with this kind of sense of, I'm going to use a Hebrew phrase, that God took out goy mikerev goy, a nation from within its surrounding nation. And so it is a time where we embrace our unique identity as a nation. However, our nation has always existed in the context of others, of other communities, and other communities have their own stories to tell. So I wonder if you make it about nationhood or peoplehood or identity, if those who come from a different background who are at your Seder table might have their own stories to tell of their own national identities. And by the way, I don't think that's a threat to the project of the Seder or to our personal Jewish identities. I think that it only then highlights maybe our differences, and then how is my narrative similar to yours, different from yours. So I think it is about telling one's personal story in the context of their identity. Does that help?
Yes, it does.
Thank you for that question. I see a hand from Laura, but I need you to unmute. I don't know if they've let you unmute.
Yes.
There we go.
Hi, I'm Laura. I'm originally from Argentina. And my background is more like being like from a culturally.
Sorry, there's a little bit of echoing, so it's a bit hard to hear you. Can you get closer to your mic maybe, or try again?
I'll try. Let's see if I. Okay, is it better now?
I'm gonna try. Try again. Go ahead.
Okay. No, I was just saying I'm from Argentina originally. My family is culturally Jewish in Argentina, not religious. Pesach has been always super important for my family, and we have celebrated many Passovers with people who are Jewish and people who are not Jewish. And what I was raised in is this idea of freedom, like as central to Pesach. And I think that there is a universal theme there. And yes, it is our Jewish holiday, but there are things that are important for humanity. And it's not by chance that the civil rights movement took the idea of Pesach, right? Like, Pharaoh let my people go, right?
Yes, thank you for saying that. There are some very universal themes, which is why I think Passover has stuck in our imagination and in our society at large. Themes of freedom, themes of, as I said before, justice. So for you, that's always been an anchor in your family. Thank you so much for sharing. I see a hand, Minda. See a hand?
Yes. I'm Minda's husband.
Hi.
Is the Rebecca Goldstein of the New American Haggadah the same as the novelist and the author betraying Spinoza?
I know that she is a writer. I can't recall her novels right now. I apologize. I don't remember. No, but you can go to her Wikipedia page. Yeah.
She doesn't. I asked that. She said she doesn't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Well, Google her.
Yes.
Someone in the chat had messaged me, and it's true. We say at the beginning of Magid, we say, Kol dichvin yeteh v'yechol, everyone who needs should come and eat. So it is a night of welcoming. I see another hand. I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name right. Jay or Jai?
It's Jai. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Good. Yeah, Jai. It's an Indian name, actually.
Great.
Okay. My situation is that my family never really talked about their lives. I didn't have the opportunity to ask my grandparents very much. I mean, a part of it was my own lack of participation. But now I find myself, getting older, and I've known very little about my personal family. So I've had to put it together through a lot, through my understanding of Judaism and as a kind of mythological, my dreams, my own self-realization, and create my own ancestry through clues and various rare memories and dreams and all this and that in Jewish mythology and all this. So in a way, it's a blessing in that way because it's forced me to look to my religion and
You
to
know,
God to find my family who are now gone.
yeah, I want to respond to that. Also, we're
Yeah.
running low on time, so I just want to respond quickly. What you're describing actually reminds me of what happens next in that song in Hamilton, which is that the widow of Alexander Hamilton, Eliza, needs to go back and piece together his life, parts of it that she doesn't know about. She says, I interview every soldier who fought by your side. And she talks about going through the pages and pages of his writing to try and piece together from what little she has what his life was really about. And we can't know if she was quote unquote right or not. She's using whatever evidence she has. And even at the Seder, there isn't an absolute truth that we know of so many of the details. We have what's in the Torah, we have those stories, but there is a lot left to the Midrash and the imagination. And that's why, that's why for so many years when our kids were young, they would act it out. They would make a play, baby Moses in the basket or whatever it was, because they're riffing on the parts of the story we know, and they're adding from their own imagination. And I believe the Haggadah is giving us permission to do that. I'm going to have to stop here. Thank you so much for joining, and I wish everybody a Chag Sameach, a happy Pesach.